Welcome to our last lecture of this semester. I want you to please, when you go home, get your 2019 calendars out and mark February 1st, which is the date of our spring lecture series. It will run Fridays, February, March, and April. The end of April is the last Friday in April is our last lecture, and that is our annual meeting. So remember to come back, please, in February. The brochures are, as we speak, are being tweaked and printed and fixed, and you will be very pleased to see them. We have a little new format. They will be in your mail mid-January, and they will be on our website in mid-January. So we hope you all come back in February. And now Michael will introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon. Today our distinguished speaker is Paul DeLande, Associate Professor and currently the Chair of the History Department at the University of Vermont. Professor DeLande is from Connecticut. He earned his bachelor's degree at Trinity College in Hartford and his master's and PhD at the University of Toronto, all with a concentration in history. He taught for 5 years at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas, before moving to UVM in 2004. Paul DeLande is a specialist on the history of modern Britain with a focus on cultural history, the history of gender and sexuality, and the history of the body and visual culture. He's taught courses on an extremely wide variety of topics, such as the history of London, the British imperial experience, a transatlantic history of masculinity, 20th century Britain in film, and women in European society, among other topics. Paul DeLande has also published very widely in his field. His books include Oxbridge Men, British Masculinity and the Undergraduate Experience, 1850 to 1920, as well as 2 forthcoming books, The Culture of Beauty in Britain, from the first photographs to David Beckham, and A Cultural History of Beauty in 6 volumes. His articles, commentaries, and reviews have appeared in many leading journals, and he's lectured at universities and conferences throughout the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. For his non-academic pursuits, Paul enjoys outdoor life in the Green Mountains and the Adirondacks, especially running, skiing, and hiking. And the title of today's lecture is Exploring London's History Through Architecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Paul DeLande.
Okay, so is this microphone working? Yes? Okay, how's that? Is that good? You can all hear me in the back there? I have a super loud voice, so it's usually not a problem. And then we're going to turn down the lights to give you, I think that's probably good. Do you want a little bit of light, or is that okay? All right. You'll be better able to see the images. So I'm delighted to be here today. I've had many colleagues who have come to speak with you in the past, and it's a real pleasure and a real honor. And I'm especially happy to be doing this particular lecture because I am about a week out from finishing a course that I teach at the University of Vermont on the history of London. So this is drawn in part from the kinds of things I do in that class. But it's giving me an opportunity today to think with you about the place of architecture as a particular kind of historical source. Historians in recent years, particularly historians of urban spaces, have spent a lot of time thinking and reflecting on the importance of the built environment to human experiences and reminding people that many of our experiences as contemporary beings or as historical subjects are conditioned by the places we live, the places we work, the buildings and institutions we inhabit. So that's kind of the operating premise for today. And I'm going to take us through a pretty wild romp. So I'm going to move from the 17th century right to the present. So the last building I will talk about is something called the Shard, which I will talk more about at the end of the lecture, completed in 2012. Before I begin, I'll just ask for a show of hands. How many of you have been to London? Oh my goodness. Okay, great. Great. So some of what I say will be familiar to you. If you haven't, that's not a detriment. But hopefully some of what I'm going to explore will be things that you've actually seen in person. So with that, I'm going to get started. So the first thing I wanted to do, and this image I fear may be just a little too small for you to be able to see. But this image is a contemporary illustrated map of London that actually includes the entirety of the city. This is the tube map, and I apologize, they are a little bit small. But both of these are representations of London that focus on the significance of the built environment. So if you look at this map, London is dominated, of course, by this massive river that runs through it. This is really the central London. So the Houses of Parliament are here. The City of London, St. Paul's Cathedral at the center of that is right here. This is an area called the Isle of Dogs, which I'm going to talk more about, which is where London docks were built in the early 19th century. Here we have Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens, Regent's Park, St. James's Park. So this is sort of the central part of the city. This is, of course, the tube map, which, if you've been to London, you'll know is an enormously complex system, and a rendering of the river that somewhat follows reality, but is sort of decidedly more geometric. So I'm going to leave those slides because I think you probably can't see them all that much. But I do want to turn your attention just for a moment to London's population, because what I'm going to be talking about over the course of the next 40 minutes or so is a city that is growing dramatically. In fact, the history of London's population is one pretty much, with the exception of a brief period of about 40 to 50 years following the Second World War, is pretty much one of dramatic growth. So if you look at the figures that I have up here, London in 1600, which I'll be beginning with buildings built in the 1670s, but London's population in 1600 is 200,000. By 1650, it's close to 400,000. 1700, close to 600,000. 1750, 650, not so big of a jump there. But 1.1 million by the time we get to 1801, which is really when the first full census is taken in Britain in any kind of effective and scientifically or statistically scientific way. By 1851, 2.7, 1901, 6.5 million. And this graph charts London's population rise from 1800, so again, about 1.1 million, through the period of the Second World War. Really, the peak of London's population before the Second World War is right on the eve of the war itself, when there are about 8.6 million people living in London. That, you'll see, the numbers drop, but then beginning in the mid-1980s and early 1990s, largely as a result of migration from the European Union, but also from other parts of the world, the population begins to rise again. And now it's about 9.1 million people. So we're talking about a really enormous city when we think about London. And that enormity, the growth of the population, is partly going to be reflected in what I have to say over the next little while. So, with that, let me turn to the first event and the first set of buildings that I'd like to talk with you about. And these are buildings that are built or created in the 1660s and 1670s as a result or in response to a great cataclysmic event that occurred in 1666. And that was the so-called Great Fire of 1666, which decimated much of the City of London. When I use the word or that phrase, City of London, especially in this period, I'm not talking about the greater metropolitan area. I'm actually talking about a very specific region within London. It's the central part, known as the City, that is basically marked on the east by the Tower of London, on the north by several old Roman gates, and on the west by Temple Bar, right? So we're talking about a relatively limited area. And that's the area that was most profoundly affected by this fire in 1666, which began early on a Sunday morning in a baker's shop. The baker had gone to bed. He had turned down his oven, well, not turned it down literally because he didn't have the option of doing that, but had dampened the flames. His daughter checked the oven just before she went to bed, but by very early in the morning, the room downstairs was filled with smoke, and the fire rapidly spread through a city that had experienced an incredibly dry summer. A summer that was so dry that the buildings, which were by and large timber framed and wattle and daub, right, in terms of how they were filled in, they were very close to each other. There were limited fire codes, and the fire spread extremely quickly. Now, if you look at this map, it's shades of pink. So this is the River Thames. This is the Tower of London that I was talking about before. These are sort of the limits of the city. The fire began on a Sunday. It spreads to this area with the lightest pink. By Monday, it spreads to the area with the darker pink. By Tuesday and Wednesday, it spreads to the area with the even darker pink, closer to red. And this is just one of many contemporary images of the fire of London itself. Now, fortunately, or unfortunately, I should say, in the initial case, the fire spread very quickly because there were prevailing winds from the east that were pushing it to the west. By Wednesday, those winds had died down. There were not really effective firefighting techniques. People were using whatever liquid they could to quench the fire, to stop the fire. They also were drawing water, of course, from the river itself. But by Wednesday or so, the fire begins to stop or cease, largely because of the dying down of the winds, but also because they had implemented strategies to pull down buildings to prevent the further spread of the fire. Now, when all was said and done, 373 of the 448 acres of this area of the city were destroyed, 13,000 houses, sorry, that should be plural, 87 churches, and 52 company halls. Company halls simply refer to those buildings that were occupied by the different guilds of the City of London. So the Goldsmiths Guild, the Merchant Tailors Guild, the Fishmongers Guild, right? All of these are medieval institutions that were effectively trade associations, but they were important cultural institutions. So what does that leave? Well, what it leaves, of course, is a need to rebuild the city. And the person who will be principally responsible for the rebuilding of the city is the man on the left here, Sir Christopher Wren. Sir Christopher Wren's dates are 1632 to 1723. Wren was a professor of astronomy, but also an amateur architect. Actually, I think we would probably agree, more than an amateur. But he is probably best known, of course, for his masterpiece, St. Paul's Cathedral, which replaced what had been a medieval cathedral built in the 12th and 13th centuries, right? But a cathedral had stood on this site for many centuries, right? So St. Paul's was a sort of non-negotiable thing. It must be rebuilt in the aftermath of the fire. And here's what resulted, and this is actually quite a good image because St. Paul's is looking quite sparkly and clean here. But it's built between 1675 and 1711. Wren is the principal architect. There are other architects involved as well. It's a style of architecture that is really a version of classical architecture, right? So you can see the classical elements, the columns that we associate with classical Greece and Rome, or ancient Greece and Rome, the symmetry, right? But it's also drawing on other influences. It's drawing, of course, on the dome influences from continental Europe, right? And it also has a degree of ornamentation that was associated with a style of architecture in the 17th century called the Baroque, which was essentially a kind of ornamented classicism. So they would use the basic components of the sort of ancient Greek and Roman ideals and then add to them all sorts of decorative items, right? It's a kind of restrained version of the Baroque. It's not a really outrageous version of the Baroque, but it's an absolutely beautiful and stunning place and still one of my favorite places to be in London. Now, Wren, as the person who helped to rebuild the city, was important in transforming the landscape of London. So this is a panoramic view of what London looks like following Wren's campaign to rebuild it. And Wren is basically responsible, of course, for St. Paul's, but he's also responsible for all of these churches that we see here. And Wren churches are still quite prominent in the city of London, although unfortunately a number of those are destroyed during the Second World War, which I'll say more about in just a couple of minutes. Now, the structure I want to spend just a minute or two talking about is this column right here. And so rather than keeping that image, I will move on to these images. This was a monument that Sir Christopher Wren constructed between 1671 and 1677. And I point to it as a really good example of how we can use architecture to understand the history of the city, because it tells a really explicit story, as do many monuments. If you think about Second World War monuments or First World War monuments, they tell very specific stories. So the monument is a column. At its base, which I'll talk about in a minute, is a sculpture, and then 3 panels that include a Latin inscription, and I'll say more about that in a minute. At the top is a rather lovely gold blaze of flames, which I'll give you a close-up in a moment. The tower is 202 feet tall, and it sits 202 feet from the site where the fire began in 1666. So let me turn to a couple of, this is quite a lovely image, contemporary image, showing it in the sunlight. And then this is the gold leaf top. At one point, Wren thought about putting a very large statue of the king at the time, who was a guy named Charles II, but it was determined to be impractical and too expensive. So this rather more attractive blaze of flames appears there instead. Now, how is this building, this structure, a way for us to understand something about the history of the city? Well, on the panels that appear that don't have the sculpture, I'll say something about the sculpture in a second. On the panels, there appear 3 different sort of sets of ideas, and I have to go to my notes here for a moment because I want to look at some quotes for a quick minute. On the north panel, which is not shown here, the city's destruction is recalled in a Latin inscription done by a prominent clergyman in London at the time. On the south panel, it's a narrative of London's restoration, right, in the wake of the fire. So after 1666, what is it that has to get done? Well, the king in particular has to issue a series of proclamations. Parliament has to pass a series of acts that will both enshrine or encode fire safety regulations, but also ensure that there's enough money to rebuild the city, right? So that panel on the south side discusses that. And then on the east side, we have a panel, and this is what's shown here. The mayors of the City of London are elected on an annual basis, right? So they're elected every year. It's largely an honorific role that the mayor of the City of London serves. And so these are all the mayors who oversaw the construction of the monument between 1671 and 1677. Now, the sculpture, which you may not be able to see all that well, tells a very important story. And this is where we can think about architecture as a historical source. So this is a kind of allegory of the recovery of the city. London is represented by this kind of retreating and somewhat downtrodden woman who represents the city. She's accompanied by figures representing liberty and other things. Over here on this pedestal is Charles II, the king, and his brother, the Duke of York, which if you know something about British history, the Duke of York will become James II, right? So he's James II. So, and here he's reaching out with a baton. In here you have representations of architectural plans, all sorts of other things. He's also assisted by 3 figures, one representing architecture, one representing science, and I'm drawing a blank on what the other one represents. Science, architecture, and liberty. Of course, I should know that. Science, architecture, and liberty. Liberty's over here, too. And what this reminds us of is, first of all, the celebration of the monarch, but secondly, that the city recovers in part as a result of its economic activity. And that's rather crucial, and that's what we're sort of seeing here. So this structure is just one of many that tell a story about the fire of London and the recovery of the city, but also narrate a particular vision of the city that says London is a place that can take it, quite literally, which is what becomes a kind of mantra during the Second World War. All right, I'm going to move forward and talk about another period, a century later, and I want us to think a little bit more about the population figures that I gave you just a few minutes ago. The 18th century, so the 1700s, are a period in which the city of London begins to expand, particularly in a westward direction. This is partly brought about by population growth. It's partly brought about by economic change as well. So there are several things driving the economic change of the 18th century. One is the rise of early industry, very early industry, but more significantly is London's center, or London's role as a center of international trade, and particularly imperial trade, right? Trade with colonies that the British have established, trade with other regions of the world. London in the 18th century is also becoming a center of banking, right? And a center of insurance. So Lloyd's Insurance, or Lloyd's Bank, that many of you will probably have some familiarity with, begins in the 18th century to basically provide insurance to ship owners, to merchant seamen, who are sending their ships abroad. In the event that they lose the ship, if they have an insurance policy, their money is returned to them. Now, with that is the growth of this area of London. This collectively is referred to sometimes as the West End, but this is really delineated as Westminster. And what I want to talk about is the area up here. This is an area around Covent Garden and an area around the region of Bloomsbury, which becomes in the 19th and 20th centuries a kind of center of intellectual life. It's where the University of London is located. It's also where the British Museum is located, right? So it's an important space. In particular, I want to think about what becomes a kind of quintessential London architectural landmark, and that is the existence or the growth of a series of squares that are residential, usually centered around a park. This is Covent Garden. Covent Garden was actually owned by a guy named John Russell, who was the first Earl of Bedford. And John Russell, like many aristocrats, earned his money principally from the rents that were generated by the land he owned. And Russell's family acquires this land in 1552, in part for their service to the crown. But the land had been acquired by the crown by confiscating the lands owned by Catholic monasteries and convents, right, in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. As Britain experiences, or England experiences, this transition to Protestantism in the 1530s and 1540s. Now, Covent Garden is designed by the architect Inigo Jones, who's a very famous architect. This is St. Paul's Church. these are the gardens to the Earl of Bedford's London estate. And then these are residential areas and shops. And Covent Garden will become an important marketplace in London. Now, this simply establishes, this is done in about 1630. So this simply establishes a precedent for what will happen throughout these western reaches of London. And I want to focus for a moment on another area owned by the Earl of Bedford, or by the family of the Earl of Bedford, and that is Bedford Square, which, not surprising, they gave it their own name. The square was planned around 1755 on lands that the family owned. It was built between 1775 and 1780. It was planned by an architect named Thomas Leverton, and then it was built by these two guys, William Scott and Thomas Cruer. The 18th century was a period in which there was actually quite a lot of land speculation and speculative growth in London as the city was expanding and growing so dramatically. Now, this is quite an impressive place. If you haven't been to it, I would suggest, first of all, it's actually closed off to traffic, so it's a lovely place to walk. But what they did was they kind of took a very simplified version of classical architecture, and they built four sides of the square. At the center of each side of the square was this stuccoed, pedimented, so this is a pediment up here, a stuccoed, pedimented building, and then a series of townhomes. These were meant to be resided in by members of the upper and upper middle classes who were flocking to this region of London to live, but who were also flocking to this region of London because it gave them proximity to the Houses of Parliament, which are in Westminster just along the river, and it gave them proximity to the court, right? So by the 18th century, Buckingham Palace is going to become an important royal residence, right? So all of this is why this is happening. So this gives us a sense of sort of London wealth. And here's just a close-up of the central building here that we're looking at here, but they're quite beautiful. Okay, so I want to kind of go forward a little bit more in time and talk about the period around 1800. This is a map of London once again from around 1800 that shows, again, the expansion of the city. So here's the original city in this area right here, that area referred to as the City of London. You can see that the boundaries have expanded to the east in what will come to be known as the East End. In the south, this area is referred to as Southwark, Southwark, and to the west, right? And also to the north. So you can see that London's boundaries are expanding. What I want to talk about is this region right here for a couple of minutes. This is an area called the Isle of Dogs. The Isle of Dogs was actually quite isolated, but it was developed rapidly and dramatically in the early part of the 19th century as Britain's trade overseas expanded dramatically. Britain had been involved in several important and really quite devastating imperial ventures over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries. The most notable of those were, of course, their activities or their involvement in the international slave trade from the 17th century until the British abolished the slave trade in 1807, and the planting of sugar, particularly in their Caribbean colonies. But Britain also had colonies that they traded with in India, right, in other parts of Asia, and increasingly in Africa. Initially, trade with Africa revolved around the slave trade. As we move more into the 19th century, it's going to revolve around the trade in natural resources. But because of that trade, there was a great need for the development of a kind of commercial infrastructure. Now, that commercial infrastructure had existed in this part of London. This is an area of London called the Pool. It's sometimes referred to as the legal quays. It looks like quays, but the British would say quays. The legal quays were established by Queen Elizabeth I in the 1550s, and these were sanctioned areas for trade. But you can see St. Paul's is in the background. Here's the monument, incidentally, that I was just talking about. Here's the Tower of London. And this is the pool. This area was meant for about 600 ships, but at its high point in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, it was sometimes hosting as many as 2,000 ships. They really could not sustain it. So what they did was they looked to that area to the east called the Isle of Dogs. Here it is. I mentioned already that two of the areas that were vital to the development were the trade in sugar and the trade in human beings and the trade in slaves. Two of the leaders in the development of this area were a guy named Robert Milligan, who was a sugar plantation owner, and a guy named George Hibbert, who was a slave trader, an important slave trader. Now, what they do is they develop a series of docks that essentially link either side of the river. So the river does this very curious curve here. This is called Blackwall, the Blackwall Reach, and this is called the Limehouse Reach, these two areas. These docks will connect these two areas, and you can see what they basically do is they construct a series of sort of inland ports here, and will build around those a series of warehouses and a series of docks that will make it possible for these ships here. So here's a good image. This is actually one of my favorite images of the region. This is by a landscape artist named William Daniel. Here's the Thames. So the Thames is kind of curving this way. This is the Isle of Dogs. And this is the sort of structure that gets created. So this is a canal that leads from one side of the river to the next. There's a little lock here that allows ships to come in and out. This is called the Blackwall Pool. And then these areas were devoted, I think this was the import area and this was the export area, but I can't quite recall. And then you had a series of warehouses built around that. Now, this dock opened in 1802, but this was not the only dock to open in the region. Here's another image of, you can start to see, this is a building. This is a building that's still there, so I'm going to show that to you in a minute. But here are the ships. Here's just a contemporary image to remind us that the docks are actually thriving, functioning places until the 1960s, although it's really after the 1930s that London's status as a port city begins to decline. It's just not very economical to get ships up the Thames and into London. There are easier ways to do that, or to move goods into Britain. But here we have trains, so they're loading bananas at the West India docks onto trains. This is from 1935. There were also docks that catered to the trade in East India or in Asia. The East India docks opened in 1805. This is an image from about 100 years later, but you can see still a very important port. And then, of course, they open docks, another dock called St. Catherine's Dock. St. Catherine's Dock is actually right next to the Tower of London. It's the one that's closest to the city itself. When St. Catherine's Dock is built, though, they actually have to displace a large number of people in order to allow or to accommodate for that dock. So when it's built, I just have to look at my notes for a moment again. They demolished 1,200 houses, which displace about 13,000 people. Right? So they're doing significant harm in the name of economic progress. Right? This is a familiar narrative, I think, for many of us. Right? But here we have St. Catherine's Docks, which again became very important in imperial trade, but have a kind of human cost. And while these are not necessarily buildings, they still remind us that the built environment is a way for us to sort of get at the intricacies of history, in particular, the history of a place like London. Here is a contemporary image. The West India docks, some of their warehouses are still there. They've actually now been turned into a wonderful museum called the Museum of the London Docklands. It's part of the Museum of London, but it tells the history of the Thames, the river that runs through London, and London's history as a port city. But of course, juxtaposed with this are a series of new buildings which began to appear in this region in the 1980s as they undergo, or this region undergoes, a pretty significant redevelopment. Okay. moving on into the 19th century. I told you this was going to be a romp. We're kind of moving through very quickly. I want to just talk, because I've sort of hinted at this, right? I just talked about the fact that largely poor people are displaced by the creation of the St. Catherine's docks. It's important when we think about the history of London that we remember that this is a city of pretty dramatic contrast with regard to rich and poor. And that's really evident in the 19th century. If any of you have read Charles Dickens, you'll be familiar with this, but also any manner of Victorian literature that kind of talks about the existence of these two worlds. So on the one hand, and this is London, this is just a London map of the 19th century, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the East End over here, but mostly I'm going to be talking in the next minute or two, next few minutes, about the western regions of the city. Okay, so London as a site of sort of poverty, wealth, and imperial splendor. So first thing I wanted to mention was that the importance of architecture is crucial to documenting both the lives of the rich and the lives of the poor. And a man who undertook a survey in the late 19th century it's called Life and Labor of the People of London, actually documented this in a series of maps. These are called Charles Booth's poverty maps. They are created, and what he did was he did a kind of color-coded map which included all of London's buildings, and then he color-coded them to reflect the social status of the people who live there. So this is from Bayswater. This was in the West End. Yellow and reds and pinks delineated either upper middle or middle classes. Blues and purples delineated the lives of the poor. And this is in the East End along an area called Whitechapel Road. And so what this helps us to understand are these dramatic contrasts in region, but also these dramatic contrasts in terms of wealth. Now you see this in other forms as well. So we have attempts to document it in this book, London, A Pilgrimage by Gustave Doré and Blanchard Gerald from 1872. This is the cover, but he tries to document the existence of what are terraced houses for the poor. We also see this in the form of photographic depictions in the work of John Thompson and Adolph Smith. These are people selling flowers and produce in Covent Garden. These are photographs, early photographs. This is a sad picture called The Crawlers, which is a woman with her child on the streets. These are women selling secondhand clothes in St. Giles. And here's a small restaurant. This is, I don't know if you can see this, but leg of beef soup for 2 pence. That's what it says up there, leg of beef soup. But at the same time that this was going on, we also had dramatic splendor being built and constructed around the city. I want to talk for just a moment about this structure. This is a building or a structure, a memorial to Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, who died in 1861. The Queen was heartbroken. They had really quite a lovely love affair. The letters between the two of them are quite dramatic reading. But a subscription was taken up. A large sum of money was raised. I think it's £120,000, yes, which in today's value is about £6 million, so it's quite a lot of money. Maybe even a little more than that. And they commissioned an architect by the name of Sir George Gilbert Scott, who created something called the Albert Memorial. This is from 1862, 1863. Now, the final product is seen here. And this is really a kind of dramatic and resplendent monument in London. It is covered by an altar or a tabernacle that actually mimics what you would see in Italian church architecture from the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. Under the canopy is a gold-covered statue of Prince Albert, right? Surrounding that statue, on this base here, are a series of depictions of men of arts and letters, and I should say they're all men. Men of arts and letters, and not uncommon in the 19th century, but also men who represent agriculture, engineering, all of the things that are driving the British economic engine. And then on the four corners, if you look at these corners here, right, these four corners, there are depictions of the British Empire, right, reminding us that Britain's reach is around the world. And this is a depiction of India. So this is a depiction of India using people in various forms of Indian dress, but also you see the elephant here, right? So there's a lot going on in a structure of this sort to remind us not only of the wealth of Britain and the wealth of London, but also of the existence of this large empire. That's also reflected, I think, in some other buildings that we see going up at the same time. And this is also by Sir George Gilbert Scott. This is something called the Midland Grand Hotel. It's built between 1868 and 1874. It's still there. It's now a hotel again. And it is at St. Pancras Station, one of the main rail stations in London. But Gilbert Scott was a proponent of the Gothic, so he liked this architectural style that harkened back to the Middle Ages. So that's what he was sort of interested in evoking in his work. And it's an interesting structure because it's curved. The intent was that carriages would come in. This was directly over the train station. They would enter through here, but there was also an entrance over here. It had a series of rather splendid and luxurious rooms, but also public spaces. This is just a painting of it. A series of public spaces. So this is the grand staircase. It's a lovely place. If you haven't been in, I would highly recommend it. Here's an older image. It had an iron frame, so he actually liked to sort of emphasize that, but the stair is really quite dramatic. Here's the dining room. Here's a breakfast room. The problem with this hotel, though, which is kind of interesting, so I'm pointing to it as another reminder of the wealth that's generated in London and how that influences buildings. But the problem with it was that it was constructed just before people began to expect that they would have ensuite or private bathrooms in their hotel rooms. And people in this hotel still had to go down the hall to use the bathroom. So it became obsolete quite quickly. People said, I don't want to go there, forget it. Especially as these new hotels were going up and providing people with even more luxurious accommodations. And it sits vacant for quite a long time. It's only been recently restored. Okay, I'm going to jump forward now from the late 19th century and kind of end in the next 5 or 6 minutes to think a little bit about London after the Second World War. All of you will know something about the history of the Second World War. What you probably know, so I won't go into great depth, is that London is bombed extensively by the Nazis over the course of the Second World War, particularly in the period of 1940 to 1941. As the war ends in 1945, the British government turns its attention to doing a better job of providing for its citizens. And it will do that in a variety of different ways, but most notably, they're going to turn their attention to the construction of housing, because the housing stock in Britain for much of the 19th and 20th centuries was deemed inadequate. So the state, both the local government of London and the national government, will devote a tremendous amount of energy and resources to creating new housing estates throughout London. And I want to talk about one that goes up in this area. This area is the Isle of Dogs again, but the region is referred to as Poplar. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to this. So this is just one of many images of the devastation of the war that the government had to respond to. But I want to talk about Landsberry Estate, which is built between 1949 and 1951. And it's built as a kind of ideal community. So there were to be modern houses, there were to be schools, there were to be shops and pubs, and there were to be places where people might be employed. So they were meant to be integrated communities. This was kind of an experiment, a social experiment in living in a different way, kind of recreating the British community, but with modern architecture and modern amenities. And you see that in a variety of different structures. So this was the clock tower. You can see this is very different architecture. This is the Congregational Church in Lambeth. And this was actually built as part of another event in 1951 called the Festival of Britain. So the Festival of Britain was actually hosted what was referred to as the live architecture exhibit. And Landsberry Estate was one of the exhibits that were on show during the Festival of Britain. But you can see the Festival of Britain is built along the southern banks. I'm going to just point to this for a second. The festival is built basically right in this area, right here, along the river, right? And it showcases modern technology and modern architecture. And these are just some of the images. This is the construction of the site. This is a woman curtsying before Queen Mary, who is the current Queen's grandmother. But you can see the very modern structure in the background. Some of these buildings are still there. Here's what the riverbank looked like. So this is a very different story from what I've been showing you. This is a story that focuses on modernism. This is a story that focuses on the ability of the British to harness technology and to embrace new international styles of architecture. And that's what we're seeing here. Here are just a couple of other examples. I have a couple of very brief 1-minute film clips that I want to show you from this period, just to give you an idea of what this looked like. And then I'll end with one final, the shard, the last structure, and open it up to some questions. So just some other examples, very modern styles of furniture here, a very modern bus shelter. So let me turn it over for a minute here. And they're just three brief film clips. Oops, I got it. The first of the film clips is going to show the king and queen, who are the parents of the present queen, visiting the Landsberry Estate being built. The second one shows a family moving into their new flat. And the third one is just a very brief film clip about the Festival of Britain itself. These are all drawn from an organization called British Pathé, which was a newsreel company that produced newsreels that were shown usually between films in cinemas. Right, so go ahead. Yeah. Let me show. Let me. Where are they?
Majesties.
The Majesties. That's the one. Yep, that's the first one. So this is the king and queen visiting Poplar, the first one. Oops. This is part of the construction. Yeah, we'll get the sound up in just a moment. Uh-oh. Fortunately, it's brief, so. No luck? Oh, the narration is so good, so. And I can't do a British accent to save my life, even though I've lived there and spent a lot of time studying. Yeah, they do have sound, so. Well, do you want to shall I just show them without the sound? Yeah, okay. So this is actually showing the building of Landsberry Estate, and of course some of the children who are going to be affected. This is the old kind of housing that they were moving from. So it gives you a sense of the squalor and the sort of unpleasantness of many of these structures. And then people leaving, and here of course we have architects. The guy does a much better narration than I can. And here's the construction. Again, new building techniques, concrete being used in much greater amounts. You sort of see, again, old London, old sales stalls. Right, so you get that sort of old vision of what it's like to live in London. this is kind of the old vision, but still, quite. Okay, and now the king and queen. So the current queen's mother and father, George VI, and Elizabeth herself. Here's a model of Landsberry. So again, sort of focusing in them visiting. You kind of get a sense, sort of open spaces, tower, and then a pathetic shovel. He wasn't a very strong man. And the queen signing the shovel. Let's see if the sound works on the next one. This one's just about done. Okay. Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. I can narrate. It's okay. Sure. So this is about a family, and I'm not going to remember the name of the family, who are the first citizens to move in. So these are what the new flats look like. So this is them sort of looking adoringly on their flat, right? Receiving the key. This is an official representative of the city, right? Obviously a little propaganda. This is where they're moving from, right? An area that had been bombed out, a terraced house. Many of these still exist in London, of course, have actually been renovated and now go for £2 million. Saying goodbye. This is quite a good clip. The family walking. In some ways it was, yeah. Unfortunately, they usually didn't have bathrooms, and they often had inadequate kitchens. That was the thing that sold these, was that they had in-house baths. And then there's one other clip which just shows people at the Festival of London sort of re-emphasizing this notion of the modern. So I'll show that, and then I'll just say 2 more minutes about one more structure, and then we'll be done. And I'll let you ask me some questions. Okay. So this is just a progress report on the building of the Festival of Britain, that structure that so here again is an architectural model. This was something called Royal Festival Hall. Some of this is still there. The National Theatre is actually on here. This was a big obelisk called the Skylon. It's quite an impressive building. This was the Dome of Discovery, where they had everything. And then here, of course, is the old city in the back, but there's the dome again being constructed. That's an old tower that's being renovated, if I remember correctly. People creating ceramics, souvenirs for the Festival of Britain. So kind of reminding people that the British economy is thriving, or they're trying to thrive. Here's a wicker, this is wicker art. So they're doing these wicker structures. Again, what they try to do at the Festival of Britain is to say we're a modern nation that has recovered from the war, but we also retain our history. Right? So there's that kind of balance that they're doing. You see that here's some sculpture, right? Very modernist sculpture that appeared at the festival itself. And then some more of the structures. Again, very modern. The flagpole. I don't know why they show the flagpole, but they do. This is an old smokestack coming down, right? So very very much to remind people that the old is now turning to the new. Okay, that's it. You want to give me back the cord and I'll finish up so we can ask some questions? A few minutes longer than I expected, but that's okay, I guess. I hope. Let's see if it comes back. Here we go. Okay, I just want to turn to one final point, and that is that over the course of the late 20th and early 21st century, The London landscape, and particularly the skyscape, has changed dramatically. While Londoners were initially quite resistant to quote-unquote American-style skyscrapers, in the period beginning in the 1990s, they turned to the skyscraper as a way of dealing with the problem of space, but also as a way of dealing with the problem of sprawl, right? Because in Britain, they have a very specific set of regulations that there's an area around the City of London that's called the Green Belt, and you can't expand into that area. So they were really running out of space. So they turned to reconfiguring old buildings and constructing new buildings. And they embraced the skyscraper finally in the latter part of the 20th century. And probably the most recent and telling example of this is this building. This building was built, it was initially called the London Bridge. This is not London Bridge, this is Tower Bridge. London Bridge is up here somewhere. London Bridge is decidedly less interesting than Tower Bridge. But it was initially called London Bridge Tower, but it came to be known as the Shard because it was said to look like shards of glass. It's a pyramidical tower designed by an Italian architect named Renzo Piano, and it was built they began to plan for it around 2000. Not surprisingly, 2008 put a little damper on that. But in 2009, they started construction, and it was completed in 2012. The building is mixed use. It has residences, very, very, very expensive residences, a very expensive hotel, restaurants, and also a series of offices. The building is owned largely by the government of the state of Qatar, right? So 95% of it, about. 5% of it is owned by a corporation called the Stellar Realty Corporation, I think, if I remember correctly. But you can actually go up into the tower, and it really represents a new vision of London. For a very long time, buildings could this is on the south side of the river, so it didn't apply. But within the City of London, you had to be very careful about not building a building that exceeded the height of St. Paul's Cathedral. But I think what it reflects is London's place as a financial capital, although that's likely to change in the coming months and years, but also the presence of foreign investment and the way in which London is this kind of multicultural, but also cosmopolitan and world city. So I'm going to end there, let you ask me some questions, and thank you for your indulgence. Thanks. We have a few minutes still for questions. Is that okay to take questions? Yeah. Oh. Any questions for me? Happy to answer any of them if you have them. Some back there.
You just began to touch on it. I wondered what you think about Brexit and whether this will slow the population growth or even reverse the population growth in London.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know if my mic is on, so I'm just going to shout. Oh, you can hear me? So I do think it's actually going to change the population of London. There are built into the Brexit agreement, there are safeguards for those people who already reside either in London or British folks who reside in other parts of Europe. But in fact, I think what you're going to see is a slowdown. I also think that you're going to see a shift in terms of London as a financial center as people either move their companies to continental Europe or to other parts of the world. So I do think it's going to have an impact. I mean, they're trying to mitigate against that, but I don't see how they can avoid it, honestly. Other? Yeah.
Hold on. It's like a hand grenade. What caused that fire in London where the apartment house burned down?
Oh.
I thought they were going to strengthen that
Yeah.
fire.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So that's the Grenfell Tower building, and that is actually one of these post-war housing estate tower blocks that's constructed. What they believe caused the fire was the external the external siding was a flammable substance or had flammable properties in it, and that's what enabled the spread of the fire. So right now, my understanding, and it's been a while since I looked into this, but my understanding is that there was an expectation that all buildings with that would have that removed and replaced. But I think that's going to take some time. But that was an absolutely devastating fire. And they continue to investigate it, but also to commemorate it. It's actually quite, if you drive in and out of London, there are a number of routes where you go right past the building, and it's really an unfortunate sight to see since it's still there. They haven't taken it down. Other?
Oh, you've got one over there.
Oh.
My question is related to the memorial for Prince Albert
Oh, yeah, sure.
and the similarity, it seemed to me, to the Victoria Memorial in Mumbai.
Oh, in where?
I mean, in Calcutta.
Oh, yes, absolutely, yeah. I think there's a tremendous amount of overlap in the memorials that get created throughout Britain and the Empire in this period. And in fact, they're kind of borrowing designs frequently from each other and kind of robbing each other in some instances. Part of it was that they were, especially when you talk about royal monuments, the expectation is to elevate the significance of the monarch, so they tend to focus on the monarch in their regalia, in their bodies. They tend to be quite realistic. So if you look at the Victoria Memorial, which is right in front of Buckingham Palace, that's the Queen in old age. And they don't hide that she's in old age at that point, just as they don't hide the current Queen's age if you look at the money. The money has changed over time, right? So the Queen's portrait changes with her age, which I think is appropriate. And I think she's pretty secure, so she's fine. She's fine with that. But I do think that you see these models or these forms replicated throughout what is at that point the British Empire. And I mean, the history of those monuments is interesting because when India gains its independence, this is the case with other countries as well, they have to figure out what to do with these monuments, right? And in some instances, they take them down, right? So the discussions around monuments and commemoration that we've had in this country around the Civil War, that also happened in the British Empire, right? Do you actually keep a monument to a British king or queen when you have an independent country that views the sort of processes of colonization as ultimately, negative? So it's a big issue. Yeah, good question. Yeah, I'm sorry, I did go a little long, so I apologize.
Did the London Olympics have any effect on the architecture of London?
The
London Olympics?
Any
yes. Permanent effect on the architecture of
Very
London?
good question. It has, and I think it did on a couple of different levels. So a lot of that architecture was constructed in the East End, right? It's constructed in the part of London that I was talking about, Poplar and Landsberry Estate, sort of out in that area. So it has transformed that area. There was actually a fair bit of clearance. So some of the things that happened when I was talking about the docks of London happened in the East End as well as they began to build for the Olympics. But the stadiums are still there. The housing is still there. I also think many things predated the Olympics in 2012. So they tried to improve the tube system. In some instances, they actually tried to introduce air conditioning to some of the tube trains because they're unbearably hot in the summer. That wasn't entirely successful. But there have also been, of course, a lot of building campaigns over the course of the early 20th century, or 21st century, excuse me. So, Millennium Bridge, which crosses the Thames between St. Paul's and the Tate Modern, that's something that's appeared. The London Eye, which is now a kind of very prominent landmark, is also really crucial, I think, in that regard. And all of that is kind of in the lead up, not necessarily for the Olympics itself, but part of this transformation of London that occurs between the 1990s and now. Any other? Happy to answer any other questions or talk to you. Yeah.
Was there ever much spinoff from the Crystal Palace?
Oh, good question.
Because
yeah, I did. I chose not to talk about the Crystal Palace. I very much could have, but the Crystal Palace was this enormous building constructed in the middle of Hyde Park in 1851 to house something called the Great Exhibition of the Industry of All Nations. And it was essentially a giant greenhouse. It was enormous. It was something like, it was like 1,068 feet long or something like that. It was very, very big. And it was intended to showcase Britain's prominence as an industrial power at that point. Half of the exhibit space was devoted to British goods and British production. The other half was devoted to the rest of the world. So the Americans had a space, and the British, or the Germans and the French and the Italians. That building was removed from Hyde Park, and it's put out in an area of London called Sydenham, which you can still go to Crystal Palace. But unfortunately, the building burns down in the 1930s, which seems weird for an iron and glass building, but the interior was things that were highly flammable. Yeah, but that's what happens to it. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, please.
Oh, wait.
Oh.
Wait.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the impact of foreign investment and, what power they would have on all kinds of things,
Sure.
Policy, whatever.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think, real estate is a weird investment, right? Because real estate is one of those things that anyone can kind of buy into, and really you don't have any impact over policy, right? So even, probably people's retirement, your retirement accounts probably have some kind of real estate investment, sometimes in the United States, sometimes elsewhere. I think in this case, the intervention of a state investor is sometimes a little more problematic. And in Britain, depending on your political perspective, depending on how much of a sort of outward-looking person you are versus an inward-looking person, you might have a different viewpoint on whether foreign powers should be investing in buildings in London. But the reality is that London is such an international city that it's almost a kind of unavoidable fact of life there. But people are conscious of what that means, right, regarding national autonomy. So the same kinds of political discussions that we're having in this country around those matters now are happening there as well. And that's always been the case since Britain entered. Britain was very reluctant to enter the EU, as you probably know, right? They took a long time to come around to that. And once they went in, they always remained ambivalent. And I think part of it was this idea about autonomy versus being part of a larger federated state, European state in this case.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you. Yeah.